I've been standing post for 11 years. 11 years of early mornings, of tourists with their cameras, of school groups pressing their faces against the iron railings, of rain that soaks through everything no matter how waterproof the kit supposedly is. 11 years of watching London breathe, the way it wakes up slow in winter, the way it hums in summer like a living thing that never really sleeps. You learn to read a crowd after a while. You learn what normal looks like, the rhythm of it. The way people move when they're just people, uncertain, distracted, looking at their phones, arguing quietly over which direction the palace is even though they're standing right in front of it. You also learn when something is off. My name is Corporal James Whitfield, and I need to tell you about the morning of the 14th of March, 2031. I've told this story to my sergeant, to the debriefers, to the men in the gray suits who don't introduce themselves, and to my mum over the phone, who cried and told me she was proud of me. I'm telling it now because I think people need to hear it properly, not the version that ended up in the briefing documents, not the version with all the technical language and the careful redactions. The real version, the one that started with a sound I'd never heard in my life and ended with me holding a child who was not, in any definition of the word that I had grown up understanding, a human being. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The morning started normal enough, which is almost funny now when I think about it. Early March in London means gray skies and a kind of cold that settles in your joints. The tourists were already gathering by 7:30. They always come earlier than people expect. Americans, mostly that time of year. A few Japanese school groups. Some European families with children who were already bored and asking for food. I was on the forecourt gate, rifle at my shoulder, chin up, eyes forward, doing what we do. Behind me, the palace was quiet. It always looks quieter than it is from the outside. There's a whole machine running inside those walls, constantly, 24 hours, but from where I was standing it looked like a painting, like a postcard of itself. The morning light was thin and watery. There were pigeons on the Victoria Memorial doing what pigeons do. A man in a yellow vest was arguing with a tourist about where to stand for a photograph. A double-decker bus rolled past on the Mall, its engine loud in the still air. Everything was completely, unremarkably normal. And then Private Chen, stationed to my left about 6 meters away, said something under her breath. She wasn't supposed to speak on post. Neither was I, we know that. Everyone knows that. But she said it anyway, barely louder than a whisper. Whitfield, don't move, but something is happening at the South Gate. I didn't move, obviously, that's not what we do. But my eyes shifted, just fractionally, just a soldier's fraction, and I caught the edge of what she was seeing. There was a woman at the South Gate. Except, and this is where it gets difficult to explain to people who weren't there because I've tried, and I've watched their expressions change from polite attention to something more complicated. She wasn't quite a woman. Not exactly. Not in the way that word usually means. She was tall, very tall. Close to 7 feet, I'd estimate, though in the moment it was hard to measure anything accurately because everything felt like it was happening at a strange angle. Her frame was elongated, like someone had taken a human figure and stretched it slightly, but not grotesquely. She wore a coat, a long gray coat that looked almost normal, almost like something you'd see on any London street in winter. And underneath it, the glimpses I caught of her skin suggested a color that I couldn't immediately categorize. Not a shade I'd seen before. Not brown, not blue, not gray, something between all of them, shifting slightly depending on the light. Her face from that distance had the basic architecture of a human face. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the proportions were slightly wrong in a way that your brain registers before your conscious mind can articulate it. The eyes were too large, perhaps, or placed at a slightly different angle. The mouth was a fraction too wide. She was holding something against her chest. Something small. Something that was moving. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. People assume it must have been fear, or awe, or some profound sense of cosmic reckoning, a soldier having his entire understanding of the universe dismantled in real time. It wasn't any of those things, not immediately. What I felt first was confusion, just pure, simple confusion, because my brain was trying very hard to fit what I was seeing into categories that already existed, and it wasn't working, and there was something almost frustrating about that. The way you feel when a word is on the tip of your tongue and won't come. And then she made a sound. I said earlier that I heard a sound I'd never heard in my life. That was it, that sound. It was a cry, there's no other word for it. It was a cry of such raw, unmistakable desperation that it cut through every layer of training and protocol and morning routine, and 11 years of standing straight and staring forward. It was the kind of sound that exists below language, below any language, apparently, including languages that were never spoken on this planet. It was the sound of a mother who was terrified for her child. The crowd heard it too, heard it and recoiled not out of cruelty, but out of shock. Out of that very human response to the unfamiliar, which is to step back and look at someone else and wait for someone else to decide what this is. Tourists moved away. Some pulled out their phones. Some grabbed their children closer instinctively. A woman near the memorial actually screamed, a short, sharp sound of pure fright, and then covered her mouth with both hands. The gate security guards went rigid. I could see them from my position, the two men stationed at the south gate, and they had the look of people who had been given precisely no training for this situation, which was fair. No one had been given training for this situation. There was no protocol that began with, in the event of a non-human individual approaching the south gate in visible distress. She was speaking. That's what I registered next. She was making sounds that were almost words, that had the shape and rhythm of words, the way music has the shape and rhythm of emotion even when you don't understand the lyrics. Her sounds rose and fell. They had urgency and pattern and desperation. They meant something. Even standing 30 meters away, not understanding a syllable of it, I knew they meant something. And the thing she was holding against her chest. It went still. That's what made me move. Because she felt it go still, I could tell by the way her body changed, the way a kind of paralysis moved through her, and she let out a sound that was so close to a human sob that it didn't matter anymore what she looked like. It didn't matter where she came from. It didn't matter that every instinct and protocol said stand your post, stay still, eyes forward. It didn't matter. I moved. Private Chen called my name as I stepped away from my post. Not loudly, she was still on post, still doing her job, even while her brain was presumably processing the same thing mine was, but with enough urgency that I heard her. I kept walking. The crowd parted for me, not dramatically, not like a film, but in the uncertain way that crowds move when someone in uniform is moving with purpose. People step aside when they think something official is happening. I used that. I walked with the posture of a man who knows exactly what he's doing, even though I absolutely did not know what I was doing. I was walking towards something I had no framework for and no plan to address, and the only thing driving me forward was that sound she'd made when the child went still. The gate guards saw me coming. One of them, a young lad, couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me with an expression of naked relief. Like I was the cavalry. Like the fact that I was walking toward the situation meant the situation was going to be handled. She turned when I was about 10 meters away. Up close, she was even harder to process than she'd been from a distance. Not because she was frightening, she wasn't, or not in the way I would have anticipated. She was frightening the way any parent is frightening when their child is dying and there is nothing they can do. She was wild-eyed and shaking and barely keeping herself upright. The gray coat she wore was damp, from rain, maybe, or something else. And her hands, the fingers slightly too long and slightly too many, were trembling around the bundle she held. Her eyes found mine. And she said something, directly to me. Urgently, looking right at me, the way you look at someone when you're past the point of caring whether they understand you. I didn't understand a word of it. But I understood the gesture, because she held the bundle out toward me, held her child out toward me, and that movement needs no translation in any language on any world. I'm quite sure of that now. It means help. It means I can't fix this. It means please, someone please. I reached for the child. Let me tell you what I saw when I looked at that small figure. She was, and I'm going to use that pronoun because it's what the mother's gestures made clear later, and I want to be accurate, she was small. Much smaller than the mother. She had the proportions of a young child, though not a human young child exactly. Her limbs were delicate and longer than they should have been for her size, like the legs of a foal. Her face had the same basic architecture as the mother's, the wide eyes, the slightly too wide mouth, except her eyes were closed. And her color, which had been the same shifting, unnameable hue as her mother's, had faded to something close to white. She was barely breathing. I could tell because I put my hand near her mouth and felt almost nothing. A faint movement of air, the thinnest thread of something, I have a niece. My sister's daughter, Rosie. She was born 6 weeks early, and I was in the hospital when they brought her in, and she was so small and so quiet that the whole room held its breath for what felt like a very long time. That's what this felt like. That very specific species of terror when something small is too still and you don't know if it's going to be all right. I knelt down on the pavement, right there, in my ceremonial uniform on the wet stone in front of the south gate of Buckingham Palace, and I laid the child carefully across my knees, and I tried to think. The mother crouched beside me. She was making sounds, low, continuous, urgent sounds, and her hands hovered over her child without touching, the way you hover when you're afraid that touching will make it worse. "Okay," I said. "Okay, what happened? Is there anything?" Obviously, she couldn't answer me. I knew that, but sometimes talking out loud helps you think. I looked at the child more carefully. Her breathing, that faint thread of breath, seemed labored. Her chest was moving, but wrongly. Too fast, too shallow, with a hitching quality that in a human child I would have associated with something stuck in the airway. I'm not a medic. I want to be clear about that. I've had basic first aid, same as every soldier. But I'm not a medic, and I was looking at a child whose anatomy I knew nothing about, whose biology I understood even less, and making decisions based entirely on pattern recognition and instinct. The pattern I recognized was that she was struggling to breathe. The instinct said, "Clear the airway." I tilted her head very gently. The mother made a sharp sound and reached toward me, then stopped, watching, and I looked. And there it was. Not an obstruction exactly, but something. A membrane almost across the back of her throat, pale and distended, like something that had swelled closed. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was normal for her species, or if it was the problem, or if touching it would make things catastrophically worse. But her breathing was getting shallower. And the mother was looking at me with those huge, terrified eyes, and the crowd that had gathered outside the gate, because of course it had, London being London, was getting louder and more agitated. And somewhere behind me I could hear one of the gate guards talking into his radio. I made a decision. I pressed my thumb very gently against the membrane and pushed. The child gasped. Not a small, tentative gasp. A great, shuddering, full-bodied gasp, a sound of sudden, desperate, hungry breathing, and her eyes flew open. They were extraordinary eyes, even then, even in that moment of pure medical crisis. The color of deep water, the kind of color that shouldn't be possible in an eye. The mother made a sound I have no description for. It was relief and terror and love and disbelief all in the same breath. She reached for her child, and I let her take her, and she gathered the small figure against her chest and rocked her, back and forth, right there on the wet pavement in front of the palace gate. I sat back on my heels. My hands were shaking. I didn't notice until then. You never notice these things until after. The crowd was completely silent. Not the silence of people who are being polite. The silence of people who have just witnessed something that has rearranged the furniture of their understanding. Every phone that had been raised was lowered. Every person who had been moving had stopped. There must have been 200 people standing on the mall, and not one of them made a sound. The child reached up, that small, too long hand, and touched my face. I don't know why that was the thing that got to me, after everything else. But it was. A child's hand on your face, regardless of what the hand looks like, is just a child's hand on your face. And something in me that had been held very tightly since the moment I stepped off my post just let go. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. My eyes just became very temporarily unable to function correctly. The mother lifted her head and looked at me, directly at me, and she said something, slowly, clearly, deliberately. She wasn't trying to be understood. She couldn't have expected me to understand, but she said it like she needed to say it. The way you need to say thank you even when you're not sure the person can hear you. I nodded, and then the gray suits arrived. End of Part 1. Part 2, when the world caught up. They came fast. That's what I remember most about the next few minutes, how fast the machinery of official response moved once it was finally moving. 3 black vehicles, unmarked, which in London means something very specific. Men and women in civilian clothes that nevertheless read as uniform if you know what to look for. The way they carried themselves. The way they spread out without being told to, covering angles, managing the crowd with gestures and body language rather than words. I'd seen this before, not this situation, obviously. But this response, this particular brand of quiet, efficient authority descending on a scene. It happens around the palace sometimes, when something goes sideways in a way that the regular security can't fully contain. What I hadn't seen before was the woman who stepped out of the second vehicle. She was perhaps 50, maybe younger, the kind of age that's hard to read on someone who carries themselves very precisely. Short hair, dark, not quite gray. A face that gave away nothing, which in itself told you everything. She walked toward the scene with the specific calm of a person who had been briefed on something that most people spend their entire lives never being briefed on. She saw the mother and child first, stopped, just for a fraction of a second, almost too brief to register. Then continued walking. She crouched down to their level, which impressed me. It was the right instinct to make yourself smaller when something frightened is looking at you. She spoke quietly, slowly, in a voice I couldn't hear from where I was still kneeling on the pavement. And then this is the part I still find astonishing, the mother responded. Not in English, not even in sounds that resembled English, but the woman in the dark coat seemed to understand. Not perfectly, not fluently, but enough. She nodded at the right moments. She made a gesture with her hands that caused the mother's shoulders to drop, just slightly, the way shoulders drop when something that has been held rigid for a long time finally gets permission to relax. I stood up. My uniform was wet through at the knees. My rifle, which I'd had to set aside when I knelt down, resting it against the gate railing, was presumably being noted by someone somewhere as a procedural irregularity. One of the civilian-clothed men appeared at my elbow, young, sharp eyes. "Corporal," he said, not as a question. "Sir," I said. "You moved from your post?" "Yes, sir." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the mother and child who were still on the pavement, the woman in the dark coat still crouching beside them. "She came in on the 612 observation window," he said, which meant nothing to me. "They've been tracking the signal for 3 days. We thought she was heading for the embassy." "What embassy?" I said. He looked at me like I'd asked which direction the sky was. "The one on Millbank," he said. "Behind the river, they've had a diplomatic facility there for 8 months. Your clearance level doesn't—" He stopped, looked at me again. "You cleared the airway." "Yes, sir." "Standard first aid." "Instinct, sir." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Right," he said. "We're going to need a full account from you, everything from the moment you noticed. Take nothing out, add nothing in." "I know how accounts work, sir." "I know you do," he paused. "The child's name, as close as we can transliterate it, is something like Syrah. The mother's name is something like Vale. The species, for the record, are what we've been calling Lurin, roughly. They're not keen on the term, apparently, but it's what we have." I looked over at them, Vale and Syrah. The child was sitting up now, those extraordinary blue-water eyes open and blinking slowly, one hand still wrapped around her mother's coat. She looked shaken. She looked like a child who'd had a very frightening morning, which I supposed she had. "They're going to be all right?" I asked. "The child had a respiratory occlusion," the young man said. "It's a condition in their species, happens in young ones, apparently, when they're under sustained stress. We think the crossing they made had—" He paused. "The point is, what you did was the correct intervention. The medical team is going to want to talk to you about exactly what you did, how much pressure, what you felt." "Of course. You should also know," he said, and his voice shifted very slightly, just enough for me to notice, "that the standard response to an unvetted first contact of this kind, particularly one that breached the palace perimeter zone, was supposed to be containment and immediate transfer. Not," he gestured at the scene. "I understand that, sir. I'm not criticizing, Corporal, I'm giving you context." He looked at the mother and child again. "She asked for help. She came here specifically because she knew there were humans here. Whatever else she thought of the situation, she trusted that humans, specifically humans near this building, would help her." He stopped again. "What, sir?" "That's significant," he said quietly. "That's more significant than most of what happened this year." They kept me at the scene for 40 minutes while the initial assessment was completed. I was given a thermal blanket by someone, which I thought was slightly absurd. I was in full ceremonial uniform, and it was only mildly cold, but I took it because it seemed important to the person offering it. Private Chen had reported my movement immediately, which was correct, and which I did not hold against her. The officer in charge of my unit appeared at some point. I won't use his name here, he'd prefer that, and stood beside me for a while without saying anything, which is a very specific kind of communication that the military has perfected over centuries. Eventually he said, "Your niece is called Rosie." I looked at him. "You mentioned her. In your account to Sergeant Davies, you mentioned her. Why?" "Because she was premature," I said. "And when I saw the child, I thought of her, of how still she was when she was born." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the instinct that made you move." "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. He had a face that was designed to give away nothing, which meant that the very slight tension around his eyes was the equivalent of another man's full emotional response. "Good instinct," he said, which from him was essentially a sonnet. The area was not fully cleared for another 2 hours. The civilian crowd was managed with the usual tools, the polite but implacable body language, the quiet directives, the strategic repositioning of barriers. Most people moved when asked. A few didn't, the ones who'd caught clear footage and knew what they had and were calculating, even then, how to use it. Those were handled separately by people with the specific skill set for that particular conversation. I was taken to a room inside the palace, one of the administrative wings, not the state rooms, though even the administrative wings of Buckingham Palace look like places where history has been soaked into the walls. And I gave my account 3 times to 3 different people. The third person was the woman in the dark coat, the one who'd crouched beside Vale on the pavement. "She said something to you," this woman said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, several things. I don't know what any of it meant." "The last thing she said, before the support team arrived, do you remember it?" I thought about it. "It was slow," I said. "Deliberate, like she was making sure she'd said it." "She was," the woman looked at me steadily. "We've had translation work going on for approximately a year. It's incomplete, it's very incomplete, but we have fragments. One of our analysts was watching the feed from the gate camera." She paused. "She said something that our analyst translates as roughly, approximately, 'You are the only one who stopped.'" The room was very quiet. "She means," I started. "She was in the zone for approximately 19 minutes before you moved," the woman said. "There were other people, gate personnel, tourists, a metropolitan police officer on the perimeter. They all saw what was happening." She paused again. "None of them moved." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "I want to be clear," the woman said, "that I'm not criticizing those individuals. The situation was unprecedented. The response protocols." "Ma'am," I said, "with respect." She stopped. "There were no response protocols," I said. "I didn't move because of a protocol. I moved because she was holding a child that had gone still." The woman looked at me for a very long moment, and then for the first time something shifted in her expression. Not much, just enough. "Yes," she said, "that's what we're counting on." They brought Vale to see me before they transferred her. I didn't expect that. I was in a corridor, waiting to be escorted out, and the door opened and she came in with 2 escorts and the translator woman walking slightly behind. She was calmer now, still large, still strange, still the thing that my eyes had to gently renegotiate every time I looked at her. But calmer. Her coat had been replaced with something dry. And Sira was in her arms, awake, clear-eyed, watching everything with those deep-water eyes. Vale looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand, gently, carefully, as if she understood that the gesture needed to be careful, over my hand. Her hand was warm. That surprised me for some reason. It was just warm like any hand. She said something to the translator woman. The translator woman said, "She says, and I'm paraphrasing, the precision isn't there yet. She says she came here because her understanding was that this place was protected, that the people here were trained for things that were difficult. She was not expecting you specifically. She was hoping for someone." I looked at Vale, at her large, careful eyes. "She says she did not think anyone would stop," the translator added. "She thought she would have to go somewhere else. She does not say where." "Tell her I'm glad she didn't have to go somewhere else," I said. The translator said something to Vale. Vale looked at me. She reached into her coat, slowly, deliberately, showing me what she was doing, the way you move around someone you don't want to frighten, and she produced something small. She pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers around it. It was warm, whatever it was, And when I opened my hand after she'd gone, it was a small disc of something that looked like polished stone but wasn't quite stone. Dark, with a faint luminescence at its center that pulsed very slowly. Like a heartbeat. I still have it. On my kitchen table. I don't know what it is exactly, and the people who might know haven't offered to explain, and I haven't pushed. Some things don't need explaining. End of Part 2. Part 3, what the crowd saw and what they did with it. You can't stop a crowd from remembering what they saw. That's the thing about these situations, and I understand this now, better than I did in the immediate aftermath. The official response can do a great deal. It can manage the space, limit the footage, have very careful conversations with very specific individuals. It can ensure that the official version of events is the one that reaches the most ears. But you can't unmake a memory, especially not 200 of them. People talked, of course they did. In the pubs that evening, in the calls home to families in other countries, in the carefully worded text messages that nevertheless said more than they pretended to. A Japanese tourist who had been standing less than 30 meters from the south gate when it happened posted something on a platform I won't name, in Japanese, which was then translated by enough people that within 48 hours it had been read by a number I'm not able to accurately estimate. The palace issued a statement that described a medical incident involving a foreign national near the south gate. It was technically accurate in the way that technically accurate statements are often accurate. It addressed what happened and managed to say almost nothing real. But people had seen. I became aware of this during my debrief period, the several days I was held, not unkindly, in a state of organized limbo while the various agencies involved in things like this figured out how to process what had happened. I wasn't allowed my phone, which was explained as standard procedure, and I had no reason to disbelieve that. But on the fourth day, a woman came to see me, not from the palace or the ministry or any of the gray suit organizations. She was from somewhere more complicated, an academic institution, she said, with connections to a program that had been running, she said, for rather longer than most people knew. Her name was Dr. Adiz Okonkwo. She was a linguist and a xenoanthropologist, which was a title that had apparently existed for about 8 years before anyone outside the program had heard of it. She was calm and precise, and very clearly accustomed to telling people things that rearranged their understanding of reality. The Lurin have been making contact for approximately 3 years, she said. Cautious contact, limited. They're not the first and they're not operating alone. There are others, different groups, let's say different cultural approaches to first contact. The Lurin's specific approach has been to observe first, to choose contact points carefully. They chose here, I said, the palace area. They chose places with concentrated human authority and human display of values, she said. Ceremonial spaces, places where humans show what they believe about themselves, whether or not they live up to it, she paused. The palace has been one of their primary observation points. I sat with that for a moment. The idea of being watched, not intrusively, not malevolently, just watched while doing what I do every day, standing post. Was she supposed to be here? Was it authorized? She deviated, Dr. Okonkwo said. The Lurin have a process, an agreement, unofficial, we'd call it unofficial. They'd call it something quite different, with a coordination body that manages these things. She was not supposed to be in the public zone. She came in through a gap in the monitoring, which happens more than the people responsible for closing gaps would like to admit. She looked at me carefully. Her daughter was ill before they arrived. The crossing, the method by which they travel here, it's stressful. On adults, it's manageable. On young children, it can trigger what she was experiencing. The occlusion. Yes, Vale panicked. It's a very human response, actually, for a species that isn't human. She made a poor decision, or at least a procedurally unauthorized one, and went to the nearest place where she knew humans in authority would be present. Why authority? Dr. Okonkwo considered the question. They've been watching, she said. They've been trying to understand how human societies work. Who holds power? Who gets listened to? In a crisis, they've observed humans in authority have resources, have the ability to act, so she went to the humans in authority. And I'm a ceremonial guard. You're a person with a weapon in a uniform standing outside a building that many humans treat with significant cultural reverence, she said. To Vale, You were authority. I thought about the gate guards who'd frozen, the police officer on the perimeter, the long minutes I'd stood at my own post before I moved. She said she didn't think anyone would stop, I said. She'd been in the zone for 19 minutes, Dr. Okonkwo said. Before you moved, yes. What would she have done if no one had moved? Dr. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. The Lurin have a process for that too, she said finally. They don't leave their people behind. They would have sent someone, but Sira, she paused. It might not have been in time. The room felt very still. The footage that's circulating, I said. The public footage, what do people think they're seeing? Dr. Okonkwo sat back slightly. A range of things, she said. Some people are certain it's fabricated. Some are certain it's some kind of elaborate hoax or street performance. Some have worked out more or less what it actually was and are being treated as conspiracy theorists, which is uncomfortable ethically but practically. She stopped. A smaller number of people know exactly what they're seeing and are responding to it in a way that will, I think, matter quite a lot over the next several years. How are they responding? The same way you did, she said. They're not asking what it is, they're asking if it's all right. There was a particular person I want to tell you about, because this story doesn't just belong to me, and I've come to understand that over time. Her name was Comfort Asair. She was a Ghanaian British woman who had been visiting the palace with her 2 sons, 12 and 9 years old, on the morning it happened. She'd been standing close enough to see clearly. Close enough that her younger son, Emmanuel, had grabbed her hand when the sound came, and she'd pulled him against her automatically, the way mothers do. She'd watched the whole thing, watched the crowd freeze, watched me walk across, watched me kneel on the pavement, and she'd been doing something that I didn't notice at the time because I was focused entirely on what was in front of me. She'd been talking to her boys. Not hushing them, not shielding their eyes, not trying to move them away from something confusing and strange. Talking to them. Low and steady, in the voice that mothers use when they want children to pay attention not just to what's happening, but to what it means. I know this because Emmanuel Asair, who is now 14 and apparently intends to join the army when he's old enough, which his mother is trying to negotiate her feelings about, wrote about it in a school essay that was shared with me by someone in the coordination body who thought I should see it. The essay was about what he'd seen, about the sound Vale made, about watching a guard break ranks and cross the forecourt and kneel on the wet stones. The last line of the essay was, "My mum told me that this is what the uniform is for, not the standing still, the stopping." I read that in a room by myself and had to sit down. I was returned to active duty 12 days after the incident. The official record contained a notation about a procedural deviation, leaving post without authorization, and also a notation that said the deviation had been reviewed and found to be consistent with the Royal Guard's mandate of protection. I'm told these 2 notations exist in an interesting tension with each other, and that certain people in administrative roles have had certain conversations about this. I was not disciplined. Private Chen, for the record, held her post the entire time, which was correct. She never said anything to me about it afterward. She didn't need to. Chen communicates primarily through eye contact and a very specific kind of stillness that means everything is understood. The morning I returned to post, the sky was clear. Actually clear. One of those days London sometimes produces in March that feel like an apology for everything that came before. Blue sky and thin gold sunlight, and the pigeons on the memorial catching the light. I stood in position, rifle on shoulder, chin up, eyes forward. But different now? That's the thing I didn't expect. Not visibly different, anyone looking at me would have seen a soldier doing exactly what soldiers do in that spot. But inside the stillness, something had shifted. The way it shifts after something happens that redraws the size of the world. A small child, human, about 6, with a red coat and a determination to make eye contact, pressed her face against the iron railing and looked at me very seriously. I did not move. But I saw her, I let myself see her. That's what I mean when I say it changed. End of Part 3. Part 4, what they decided, and what was actually true. The decisions were made in rooms I was never in. I want to be honest about that. Whatever happened after, whatever the larger response was, the shape of it, the direction, I was not in those rooms. I was a corporal who had left his post to help someone, and the people who make large decisions about large things were not consulting me. What I know came in pieces over months. Some of it through Dr. Okonkwo, who I continued to meet with, a debriefing arrangement that gradually became something more like a conversation, and eventually something I'd cautiously describe as a friendship, built on the shared experience of knowing something unusual and having to carry it carefully. Some of it came from the gray-suit man, the one who'd appeared at my elbow on the day of the incident. His name, I eventually learned, was Marcus. Just Marcus, which told me something about how these arrangements work. And some of it came from Vale herself. I need to explain how that happened, because it still seems unlikely to me even now. 3 months after the incident, Marcus appeared at my flat. Not at the barracks, at my flat, which meant he knew where I lived, which was not surprising but was still faintly unnerving. He knocked on the door in the early evening and stood there in civilian clothes looking like someone who'd had a very long several months. "She's asked for you," he said. I stood in my doorway, Vale. Through the coordination body, formally, or as formally as these things work, which is not very formally yet. The diplomatic channels, he stopped. "We're building the channels as we use them. It's messy, but she's made a request." "For what?" "A conversation," he paused. "She wants to talk to the man who stopped. That's how she describes you." The man who stopped. The meeting was at a location I'm going to describe as being near the river, because that's as specific as I've been authorized to be. It was a room that looked like it was trying very hard to be neutral, plain walls, low light, nothing on the surfaces that would mark it as belonging to anyone. There was a chair, and across from it, an arrangement that had been assembled to accommodate someone of Vale's proportions, which was a kind of large, backless platform that she sat on in a way that looked comfortable for her even if it wouldn't have been for me. Dr. Okonkwo was there, 2 others I didn't know, and Vale. No Sira. I noticed that immediately and felt something tighten in my chest until Vale noticed me noticing and said something to Dr. Okonkwo. "She says the child is well," Dr. Okonkwo said. "She's with the others. She's been asking about you." "About me?" "Apparently she describes you as," Dr. Okonkwo paused, consulting a note, "as the one with the hard coat and the soft hands." I thought about that for a moment. "The uniform," I said, "and when you checked her breathing, yes." I sat across from Vale. She looked different here than she had on the pavement, calmer, in a way that allowed me to actually look at her properly for the first time. She was striking. That's the honest word. The shifting color of her skin, the large, careful eyes, the stillness that she carried the way certain people carry authority, not performed but simply present. She looked at me for a long time. And then she began to speak, in her own language, slowly, with pauses for Dr. Okonkwo to interpret. What she said over the course of about 2 hours was the following, and I'm summarizing, because I want to give the essence of it without claiming more precision than Dr. Okonkwo's translations could offer. She had been watching the Palace Zone for months. She knew what we were, generally, had built an understanding of human social structure from observation. She understood, roughly, what the ceremony meant, what the uniforms meant. She'd observed that humans used ritual to mark what was important to them, and that the people placed at the entrances of important buildings were considered a specific kind of important person. When Sira became critically ill, she had gone to the place where she believed the most capable and most authorized humans would be present. That was her reasoning. She wasn't trying to make contact. She wasn't attempting to initiate diplomatic relations. She was a mother with a very sick child who had run toward the nearest source of human authority she could find. When the humans she found did not respond, when the crowd pulled back and the security personnel froze and the long minutes stretched out, she had not been surprised. She had been terrified, but not surprised. Her understanding of humans, built from months of observation, had prepared her for the possibility that the impulse to help would lose to the impulse to not engage with the unfamiliar. Then I moved. She'd watched me cross the forecourt, had tracked me with the specific attention of someone measuring a decision. Or that's how Dr. Okonkwo interpreted the phrase she used, which I'm told is literally closer to watching a choice walk toward her. When I knelt down and took Sira into my hands, she said something that Dr. Okonkwo struggled with for a moment before translating as, I understood for the first time that the watching had told me only part of the truth. "What does that mean?" I asked. Dr. Okonkwo asked her. Vale responded, and Dr. Okonkwo sat with it for a moment. She means, Dr. Okonkwo said carefully. She'd been watching humans and building a model of what humans were. The model was accurate in many ways, but it had not included this, the thing you did. She didn't think the model had room for it. For someone stopping, I said, for helping. Dr. Okonkwo looked at me. She'd seen humans help each other, she said. She'd seen compassion in the way humans treat their own group, their family, their community. She'd observed it, but she didn't think. She stopped, looked at her notes. The phrase she uses, I think it means something like, she didn't think the circle was big enough. I looked at Vale. She was watching me with those vast, careful eyes, and she said something very quietly. Dr. Okonkwo said, she says you made it bigger. There's a thing that happens. I've been told in certain conversations between representatives of different groups, different peoples, different cultures, where a moment occurs that is not diplomatic, not strategic, not the result of any deliberate planning, but that matters more than any of the deliberate things. A moment that creates something real where before there was only the possibility of something real. I have been told, by people who understand these things better than I do, that the morning on the South Gate pavement was that kind of moment. Not because of what it led to politically or diplomatically. Those conversations were already happening in other rooms, through other channels, following the careful architecture that people who plan these things construct. But because Vale went back to her people and told them what had happened, told them that she had been desperate and afraid and had gone to the humans and that a human had stopped, had come to her without being asked, had handled her child without hesitation, with care, and this is the word Dr. Okonkwo struggled to translate, the word that Vale kept returning to with ordinariness. Not heroism, not ceremony, not the kind of help that is performed because it will be seen. Just ordinariness, the thing you do because it's what you do. That's the thing they didn't have in their model, Dr. Okonkwo told me one afternoon. The Lurin are an extraordinarily sophisticated species in many ways, but their social structure is it's collective in a way that makes individual spontaneous action quite rare. What you did, acting alone, without coordination, outside of protocol, because you personally decided to, that's not something they have a strong category for. We're not always like that, I said. I know, she smiled slightly. I think that's what makes it remarkable to them that you could be, that it was a choice. The diplomatic work that followed is not mine to describe. It belongs to people with different skill sets and different mandates, and they're doing it. Carefully, slowly. In the way that things need to be done, when the stakes include the future of two or more different kinds of people learning to share a universe without catastrophe. But I know that Vale's account of the morning on the pavement was part of the foundation. A stone laid in the ground before the building could begin. I know because Marcus told me in his cryptic, careful way, your morning mattered, he said, in the flat near the river room, and that was all he said, and somehow it was enough. I know because Dr. Okonkwo showed me a fragment of translated text, a document of sorts, that the Lurin coordination body had produced in the months following. In it, the morning of the 14th of March, 2031, is described, roughly, approximately, through the limited lens of translation, as a demonstration of something in humans that their observation had not fully accounted for. She told me the phrase that was used. It translates as something like the willingness to extend the circle. I've thought about that phrase more than I've thought about most things in my life. End of Part 4. Part 5, the postcard from somewhere I'll never see. The disc is still on my kitchen table. I've moved once since the incident, a flat in Pimlico, slightly larger, slightly closer to the river, slightly less damp in winter. The disc came with me. It sits near the kettle, which is probably not the dignified position it deserves, but it's where I put it when I first arrived, and I haven't moved it since. And there's something about the specific ordinary domesticity of that, the disc from a creature from another world, next to a kettle that needs descaling, that I find I'm not ready to change. It still pulses, slowly, steadily. My sister thinks it's a nightlight. My nephew Rory, who is 8, thinks it is the best thing he has ever seen. My mum, when she visits, looks at it with an expression I have no precise name for and asks me if I'm all right, and I say yes, and she makes tea and neither of us says anything more about it. I'm still serving, same post most days. The south gate occasionally, which some people, colleagues, the officer who said, "Good instinct," watch to see if I have any observable reaction. I don't. Or if I do, it's internal, and I've gotten quite good at keeping internal things internal. But I notice things now that I didn't used to notice. Not unusual things, there haven't been more unusual things, not in the public zone, not in the visible world. Just ordinary things, the way crowds move. The moments when something happens and everyone in a space has to decide at the same moment whether to step forward or step back. People step back a lot, that's not a criticism. It's just true. The impulse to not engage with the unfamiliar, the complicated, the potentially frightening, it's powerful, and it's almost never malicious. It's just human, the waiting to see what someone else will do first. I've started stepping forward a little earlier than I used to. Not dramatically, not performatively, just a little earlier, in the spaces where a decision is available to me. I think about Vale saying that she'd built a model of humans, and the model hadn't had room for what I did. I think about Emmanuel Lasserre writing in his school essay, not the standing still, the stopping. I think about Sira, the hard coat and the soft hands, those deep water eyes opening. The last thing I want to tell you is about a message I received through Dr. Okonkwo, about 8 months after the incident. It had come through the coordination body, translated and retranslated, the original meaning wearing slightly thin in the process the way meaning always does when it travels too far through different mouths. But what it said, as closely as Dr. Okonkwo could render it, was from Sira. Sira, who was apparently doing what young people of her species do when they are processing significant experiences. She was learning. She was learning human words. Not many, not fluently, in the laborious way that very young children learn words in any language, by attaching sounds to things and testing them. The words she had apparently first chosen to learn were practical and simple. Water, cold, yes, no. And then, according to the message, the next word she'd asked about. She described a situation to whoever was teaching her. A situation involving, as far as the description could be interpreted, a person approaching another person who is frightened. Coming toward them, choosing to come toward them. She'd wanted to know the word for that. The word in English. The answer she'd been given in English was help. And she had apparently repeated it several times, practicing. The way children practice words that matter to them, turning them over, feeling the shape. Help. And then the message said she'd asked one more thing. She'd asked, is that what the hardcoat man was doing? And whoever was teaching her had said yes. And she had said the word again, to herself. And then, according to the person who was there, who included this in the message because they thought I should know it, she'd looked pleased with herself, in the specific way that young things look pleased when they've learned something that feels important. Like she'd found the right word for something she'd been trying to name for a long time. Help. I think about that sometimes when I'm standing post. When it's early and the light is thin and the tourists are gathering and a pigeon is doing something questionable on the memorial and London is being its ordinary, complicated, improbable self. I think about how strange it is that the universe is apparently full of people, all kinds of people, shapes and colors and biologies that our languages don't have words for yet, and that they are all, apparently, capable of the same terror. The terror of watching something small go still. And how some of them, when they are at their most terrified, when they are clutching that stillness against their chest on a wet pavement in a foreign place in a foreign world, some of them look up and hope that someone will stop. I think about how many times in a day, in a week, in a life, someone somewhere is making that choice. The stopping or the not stopping, the step forward or the step back. And I think about how much that choice matters, not in a grand, ceremonial, historic way. Not in the way that gets noted in documents or briefed upward, or translated into diplomatic significance. Just in the simple, physical, irreducible way that a child breathes because someone made a choice. That's the whole of it, really. That's what I want you to take with you when you walk out of this, away from this story, back into whatever day you were having before you started listening. The circle can always be bigger. You just have to stop.